America, land of the free, home of the brave, a nation built on ideals of liberty and justice. But beneath the surface of this shining city on a hill lies a hidden history. This is the story of American policing, a story that begins not with protecting the people, but with preserving a system of power. We journey back to the 17th century. The first settlements cling to the edge of a vast wilderness. Amidst the promise of a new world, a darkness takes root: slavery. This brutal system demanded control, demanded enforcement. Thus, the seeds of American policing were sown, not in the pursuit of justice, but in the soil of oppression. The legacy of these patrols, though often hidden, is woven into the very fabric of American law enforcement. The story of American policing is a story of evolution. From the shadows of the slave patrols, a new form of law enforcement emerged. But the transition wasn't a clean break. The DNA of control, of maintaining order at any cost, was passed down. As America grew, so did its police forces. They took on new roles, confronted new challenges. The 20th century brought new tools of control. The wars on crime and drugs fueled the rise of militarized police forces. This is the hidden history of American policing. The year is 1704, Carolina. The air hangs heavy, thick with humidity and the stench of fear. The colony, built on stolen land, teeters on a knife edge. Every rustle in the fields, every shadow in the night, whispers a single word: rebellion. The enslaved Africans, stripped of their freedom, outnumber their captors. The slave patrol is born. The tools of the slave patrol were as crude as they were cruel: whips, guns, dogs trained to track and maim. Their methods designed to dehumanize and break the spirit, public beatings, families torn apart, psychological torment woven into the very fabric of everyday life. Runaway slaves, those brave souls who dared to seek freedom, became the primary targets. Captured and returned, they faced punishments that defy description. This was state-sanctioned terror, woven into the legal framework of the colonies. The brutality of the slave patrols wasn't confined to the plantations. Their reach extended into every facet of life in the antebellum South. They patrolled the streets of cities and towns, their presence a constant reminder of the precariousness of black lives. Black people, whether enslaved or free, were subject to arbitrary searches, harassment, and violence. Their movements were monitored, their gatherings broken up. The simple act of existing in public space was fraught with danger. The legal system, rigged against black people, offered little hope of redress. These wounds, inflicted over generations, would leave scars on the soul of a nation. The Civil War may have officially ended slavery, but the legacy of the slave patrols lingered. As the South rebuilt, new forms of law enforcement emerged, but the seeds of racialized policing had already been sown. In the years following Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow laws cemented the second-class status of black Americans. Law enforcement, often composed of former slave patrol members, played a key role in enforcing this new era of segregation and oppression. The tactics employed by these nascent police forces, racial profiling, the use of excessive force, the suppression of civil rights, were chilling echoes of the past. The language may have changed, but the underlying message remained the same. Black lives were less valued, less deserving of protection. The ghost of the slave patrol haunted the 20th century, manifesting in the brutal suppression of the civil rights movement, the war on drugs, and the mass incarceration that continues to plague black communities today. This is not just history. It is a living legacy, a wound that continues to fester. The American story. A tapestry woven from countless threads. But some threads are darker than others, stained with the blood of injustice. The forced removal of Native Americans is one such thread, a shameful chapter woven deeply into the fabric of American history. As the young nation expanded westward, it collided with the original inhabitants of this land. Native American tribes, with their own cultures, languages, and deep connections to the land, stood in the way of manifest destiny. The insatiable hunger for land, for resources, fueled a policy of displacement and erasure. Section 2. The Long March. Imagine, if you can, the terror of that journey. Families herded like cattle, children dying from disease and exhaustion, elders left behind to die on the side of the road. All under the watchful eyes of armed men, their badges a symbol of authority, their actions a betrayal of the very ideals they claim to uphold. This wasn't just about land, it was about power, about crushing the resistance of a people and erasing their very existence. Section 3. Erasing a people. The forced removal of Native Americans wasn't just a physical displacement, it was an attempt to erase their culture, their language, their very identity, and once again, law enforcement played a key role in this cultural genocide. Children were ripped from their families and forced into government-run boarding schools. Stripped of their language, their traditions, their names, they were taught to reject their heritage and embrace the ways of the white man. The legacy of this trauma reverberates through generations. Native American communities ravaged by poverty, addiction, and despair still bear the scars of this historical injustice. Section 1. The Hammer and the Badge, the Industrial Revolution. A time of unprecedented change. Machines roared to life, factories sprang up like iron mushrooms, and cities swelled with waves of workers seeking a better life. But this new era of progress had a dark underbelly. The gap between the haves and the have-nots yawned ever wider. The workers, toiling long hours in dangerous conditions for meager wages, began to organize. Unions rose, demanding fair treatment, fair pay, a voice in their own destiny. But those in power, the factory owners, the industrialists, saw these demands as a threat. The year is 1892, Homestead, Pennsylvania. The very air crackles with tension. Workers at the Carnegie Steel Mill, pushed to the brink by wage cuts and unsafe working conditions, have gone on strike. The response from the company is swift and brutal. Hundreds of private security agents, the infamous Pinkerton detectives, are brought in to break the strike. A fierce battle erupts. Workers, armed with whatever they can find, defend their picket lines against the hired guns of the company. The clash leaves several dead on both sides. The use of police as strikebreakers had a profound impact on the development of American labor law and the relationship between law enforcement and working-class communities. It solidified the perception of the police as tools of the powerful, protectors of property rights over human rights. The violence inflicted upon workers, the arbitrary arrests, the suppression of free speech and assembly, sowed seeds of mistrust that would take root and grow. In the minds of many, particularly within immigrant and minority communities who bore the brunt of this repression, the police were not seen as protectors, but as oppressors. This mistrust, born in the crucible of industrial conflict, would echo through the decades, shaping the dynamics between police and marginalized communities for generations to come. It would fuel social unrest, ignite riots, and cast a long shadow over the quest for social and economic justice. The 20th century dawned, a century of unprecedented technological advancement. But this progress, like a double-edged sword, brought with it both promise and peril. The very tools that could connect the world could also be used to control it. And nowhere was this duality more apparent than in the evolution of American policing. The rise of industrial-scale warfare with its tanks, its planes, its ever more lethal weaponry, cast a long shadow over civilian life. The lines between soldier and police officer began to blur, as surplus military equipment found its way onto the streets of America. What began as a trickle soon became a flood. The rationale? To combat crime, of course. To maintain order. Section 2. From riot control to war on drugs. The social upheavals of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war protests, provided fertile ground for the further militarization of policing. Faced with widespread civil disobedience, law enforcement agencies across the country responded with a show of force that shocked the conscience of the nation. Images of police brutality, beamed into living rooms across the country, sparked outrage and debate. But instead of leading to a re-evaluation of policing tactics, the response from many in power was to double down, to further equip and empower law enforcement agencies to quell dissent. The war on drugs, launched in the 1970s, provided a new pretext for the expansion of police powers and the acquisition of military-grade equipment. The rhetoric of this war, with its emphasis on enemies, battlegrounds, and zero-tolerance policies, further blurred the lines between policing and warfare. SWAT teams, once reserved for hostage situations and other high-risk scenarios, became commonplace, deployed for drug raids, often with tragic consequences. The use of no-knock warrants, the militarization of police uniforms and vehicles, all contributed to a growing sense of alienation and fear between police and the communities they patrolled. Section 3. A culture of combat. The consequences of this militarization of policing are far-reaching and profound. It has fostered a culture of combat, where officers are trained to view every interaction as potentially lethal, where the use of force is often the first resort rather than the last. This culture of fear and aggression disproportionately impacts marginalized communities, particularly Black and brown communities, who are more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, and subjected to excessive force. The data is stark, the patterns undeniable. The militarization of policing has eroded trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. It has created a climate of fear and suspicion, where even the most routine encounter with the police can escalate into violence. This is not to say that every police officer is a soldier in disguise, but it is to acknowledge that the systems, the structures, the very culture of policing in America has been profoundly shaped by this militaristic mindset. And until we confront this uncomfortable truth, until we fundamentally reimagine the role of police in our society, the cycle of violence and mistrust will continue. A crisis of legitimacy. From slave patrols to militarized police, American policing is a story of power and control. It is a living legacy, a wound that festers today. Videos on smartphones shake our collective conscience. Names like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor are etched into memory, reminders of a system that fails to protect all equally. Protests after George Floyd's murder were a cry of anguish, exposing deep-seated mistrust and systemic racism. The militarization of policing, a trend that accelerated in the latter half of the 20th century, has exacerbated this crisis of legitimacy. The proliferation of SWAT teams, the acquisition of military-grade weaponry, and the adoption of a warrior mindset have created a climate of fear and suspicion, where even the most routine encounter with the police can escalate into violence. This approach to law enforcement, with its emphasis on control and dominance, is fundamentally at odds with the principles of community policing, which emphasizes de-escalation, dialogue, and building trust between officers and the people they serve. The over-policing of Black and brown communities, the racial profiling, the stop-and-frisk tactics, and the disproportionate use of force are not just symptoms of a few bad apples. They are the bitter fruit of a system rooted in a history of oppression, a system that has never fully reckoned with its past. The wounds of that past are still raw, still open. And until we address the root causes of this crisis, until we acknowledge the systemic and institutionalized nature of racism in our society, we will continue to see these cycles of violence and mistrust play out on our streets. Section 3. A reckoning deferred. The question now is not whether we need police reform, but what that reform should look like. We need a fundamental reimagining of the role of police in our society. Some advocate for defunding the police, redirecting funds to community-based initiatives. Others call for demilitarizing the police. Still, others advocate for greater accountability and transparency within law enforcement. These ideas are being debated in living rooms, town halls, and on the streets of America. The time for a reckoning is now. The story of American policing is long and troubled. From slave patrols to militarized police, it's a tale of oppression and control. Not just bad apples, but a flawed system. A disturbing pattern emerges. Power used to control and suppress. The legacy of slave patrols lives on, particularly affecting Black and brown communities. Acknowledge history to build a just future. The protests in response to the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were a cry for justice. They demanded change across generations. The world watched, horrified, as American policing's brutality was exposed. From anger and despair, a determination to break the chains of the past emerged. To create a world where Black lives matter and all lives are respected. The demand for police reform became a roar that could no longer be ignored. Imagine a different kind of policing. Officers trained in de-escalation, conflict resolution, and cultural sensitivity. Police departments reflecting community diversity, seen as partners, not adversaries. Resources redirected to community initiatives addressing crime's root causes. investment in education, healthcare, and social services over incarceration. A vision worth striving for, rooted in justice and equity,